So I'm here with Mr. Ben Smyth. I wanted to shoot it
Hi,
straight to
good to
you.
be here.
Who are you and what do you practice?
Yeah, so I'm a friend of Sam's, evidently, and my main practice in the terms of ecology of practices is Vipassana meditation and also loving kindness meditation. So Sam got me onto Vipassana actually about 4 years ago with a 10-day silent retreat, Goenka style. And since then, on and off, I've been slowly getting more and more into the practice. And now I'm doing 2 hours a day most days, and also 5 minutes of loving kindness meditation at the end of each 1 hour session. And next week, I'm volunteering on a retreat for a couple of days, which should be nice. And I also do a bit of breath work, just to just a little bit, just dipping my toes in the water, so to speak. Yeah. And I found that those two practices are really complementary, but I do gravitate a lot to Vipassana for some reason. And I think the more I practice, the more faith I have in the practice in terms of its transformative potential, but also just sheer joy in the process itself tends to increase the more I practice.
Mm. So I want to ask you about that. I mean, before I do that, I want to kind of tee this up that we're going to spend the next probably couple of hours speaking about the connection between this ecology of practices and a broad response to the metacrisis, meaning crisis that we was just chatting last weekend and we spent like 3 or 4 hours just diving headlong into all this material and we felt like it would be interesting to others maybe to record some of that. But as we sort of slowly move toward that broader conversation, I want to ask you about transformation. As you just named, you invoked that you feel that these practices, including Vipassana and breathwork, that they have transformative potential. What do you mean by that? How do you know that? And what do you take that transformation to lead to?
Mm, that's a good question. And also, a lot of that is above my pay grade in
No, I mean,
terms
in
of
terms of your
what do I mean by
experience.
transformation. But in terms of my experience, yeah, well, I can see changes in my character from these experiences. I'd say chiefly, I feel that I've become a more compassionate person. And I think that my self-discipline is improved, as well as my ability to contemplate quite terrible things like existential risks. And
Mm.
I think if I didn't meditate, I probably wouldn't have ever gotten interested in AI safety or just existential risks in general, because it would have been too terrible to think about. And I guess that's a separate conversation, or maybe it isn't, but I don't think
Mm.
most people, to be honest, have the
Hmm.
either the emotional resilience or the interest to seriously discuss existential risks. But I guess there's also an element of having a sense of a lack of agency in regards to, say, global war or AI risk or bioweapons, although that is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. But yeah, I think without meditation, I definitely would have had a much shallower appreciation of these concerns. But I guess meditation opens up the space, the emotional space for me to sit with the predicament that we're in as a species and to really look it in the eye, so to speak, without without really feeling an intense need to escape that feeling. Obviously, I still do feel overwhelmed by it sometimes, but I'd say I've now, at least the AI risk, I've kind of accepted the situation, and I've done a lot of research into it, into just AI capabilities progress, but meditation has definitely been a critical part of facing it and changing my perspective based on the information that I've encountered.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. So I hear you. Like I'm noticing several things already is that the way that you speak, the way that you come across, the way you convey yourself is reflective. You're sort of invoking or demonstrating a path of contemplation, like these practices that you're naming, Vipassana and breath work. You name that they unlocked a different kind of perspective. They opened a kind of spaciousness, a spaciousness which has this quality of emotional capacity. So from a perspective that benefits from that spaciousness, there's more emotional capacity. And so what I notice is that from out of that spaciousness, it's possible to get a sense for, like to see and also to touch this relationship between psyche encountering reality. So you could say the mind, like the mind in its contemplation of existence and the fraught, very risky nature of existence. But it's not just the mind, it's the whole psyche. It's the way that the whole being contemplates reality and is facing reality, in touch with reality. And that opposition, that primary opposition that we live in, it's like a kind of existential stance to live within that conflict between psyche and matter, you could say. That can be
Hmm.
seen. That whole conflict can itself be held. We can get advantage on that through transformative practice. And obviously the claim then would be that from out of that perspective, like by witnessing the psyche and its confrontation with matter, by witnessing the mind relate to body, by witnessing life confront reality and its risky nature, by witnessing that we can notice something, see something, discover something that could help.
That could help personally or with the metacrisis predicament.
Well, both, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And I think those capacities to see and to observe the link between the psyche and the external world, everyone has that ability to some extent. But I think some people will benefit more from certain practices than other people. Yeah, because for Vipassana, I remember that you went on a 10-day retreat before me, but you didn't find it as beneficial.
Just losing your signal there for a minute.
Have we lost connection?
No, I think we're okay now. But you were saying that I went on Vipassana first, but you found it a lot more
Oh,
beneficial.
okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
Oh no,
but
absolutely.
you, yeah. And I went through a phase of trying to proselytize to everyone in my life that you got to try this technique and it's going to change your life. And I think for some people it definitely will, but others might gravitate more towards breath work or dynamic meditation or more relational practices, um, or other forms of deep awareness. And yeah, I'm not sure. I remember the Buddha said that not everyone, almost no one can be enlightened, something along those lines. So I wonder if what he meant by that was that a lot of people don't have the innate capacity for transformation, or if it's just that the the culture that we live in and the institutions that we have really do not promote or encourage these transformative practices. So it's kind of like most people could benefit, but most people just don't ever have the opportunity to discover and develop these practices. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great inquiry. I noticed like the relevance of embodiment already, and you sort of already sort of gestured over toward that, and I do want to go back toward it, like in the context of approaching topics that are scary or confronting, that feel very real, the capacity to sit with them, to contemplate them, to hold them, feels like an embodied capacity, particularly. So I want to focus on that, but I think the connection here is Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha will be a Sangha, right? The next Buddha will be a community. And we see this in the model of the academy or the monastery, where the what we call the individual, like the individual person, they're surrounded by a milieu, right? They're in a place, they're in a community, they have these transformative practices, and they're situated within a worldview. And all of that is shaping them. I mean, we understand this about the roots of human culture, right? Are that our human consciousness is malleable far more than we take it to be. And so we are being conditioned right now by the context within which we're operating. And the thing
Mm,
about humans, which is so special, is that we worked out how to change our environment, right? Rather than waiting for genetics to grow us some sharper claws over several millions of years, we worked out how to basically make tools, which is like much faster. And we basically extended that tool making capacity to completely remodel entire environments around us. And so this is what John Vervaeke, one of my teachers, talks about as this self-world relationship that allows us to be adaptive, be fitted to any environment on the planet because we design it to suit us. And the idea being here that if we can understand that, and it's not only about design in a sort of top-down way, it's also very much about facilitating bottom-up emergence. But if we can do that with a mind to the sort of intersection of consciousness, love, and agency are the three qualities that I have in mind. If we can sort of design to sort of maximize those qualities without, being too, without measuring it, without quantifying it, then I think we would be able to, the idea is, and it's not just an idea, that we'd be able to condition our own consciousness in such a way that gives rise to more of those qualities, more love, more consciousness, and more agency. And this is like enacting or, a vector toward enacting the next Buddha will be a Sangha. What Viveki used to call reverse engineering enlightenment. And just to connect that with the bit about embodiment, the idea is that the individual participates in something greater than themselves. So the individual is bound. The individual is bound to the context that they're in. They're bound to the milieu that they operate within, right? And they feel a deep sense of connectedness to that, which from which they derive a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning in life, blah, blah, blah. A lot of good things come out of that sense of being bound rather than being disconnected and atomized and alone, alienated. And when we're
mm,
bound in that way, we basically fit in. to the larger social body, which we don't feel at the moment, roughly speaking, because the social body has been completely hollowed out by, you know, capitalism and modernism and all the other isms that we identify with instead of the community that is absent. So when we can retribalize, when we can get back into the context of operating as a group again, and when we feel bound to that, when our consciousness is shaped by that in a way that we haven't seen before, then we unlock a capacity that is an emergent property of those groups. So it's not just about the individual awakening at that point, it's about this spaciousness that exists within the social body. So this is why this conversation about embodiment gets quite interesting because it's not just our physical form that we're talking about. It's all the layers of embodiment and then also the collective body that has a capacity that we do not have, namely a capacity to address the meaning crisis and metacrisis by application of exactly those qualities, love, consciousness, and agency, I said.
Mm. Yeah, that does make sense. Um,
It's lucky for me.
yeah,
So let me direct it to you in terms of embodiment. Like we started to talk about that. You mentioned that your practices, including Vipassana and breathwork, for example, they unlocked a spaciousness, a capacity within your own body, right? To hold difficult reality, existentially confronting reality. Can you elaborate a bit about that? Like, help me understand this connection between the spaciousness that you found and embodiment.
that's a good question. Um, I think it might be helpful to take a step back in terms of my life journey. So I started meditating in 2021, just 10 minutes a day on waking up, Sam Harris. And even on 10 minutes a day, after a couple of months, I did notice some quite interesting changes in my day-to-day conscious state, just of being more detached and dispassionate emotionally. And I think it was just realizing how malleable the mind is, which you were gesturing towards, that really changed my worldview about the nature of mind. And it really made me excited about the possibility of developing my consciousness and my awareness. And then I think it really helped me weather the next few years because in 2022 my dad passed away, so that was obviously quite a big shock and kind of a transformative event in my life. A parent dying is quite a big event in anyone's life because it forces you to confront your own mortality and it reminds you that you know your parents are not always going to be around to provide that canopy of security and guidance. And you are ultimately on your own in a way, and you have to forge your own path and make up your own set of values and principles. So there was that. And then later in the same year, 2022, I think my I read a book about microplastics and pollutants and declining sperm counts and all the carcinogenic effects that these chemicals have and how pervasive they are and how little regulation there is, or even public awareness about their effects. And this was before I'd gotten into the meta crisis or existential risk, but that really sent me for a loop and made me quite depressed for a couple of months, I would say. It made me very pessimistic. Just that issue alone was enough to make me open my eyes towards how kind of screwed we are in a way. Although I don't think we're screwed. I think we might be screwed, but it's not definite, and we can still change the outcome, change the trajectory of human civilization. So that was kind of one shock after another. So with my dad dying, it was more of a personal shock, and losing that security and realizing the shortness of life. And then with the microplastics, that was the first major systemic crisis that I got interested in, and that set the ball rolling. And then I had quite a few discussions with Sam over that period, and he got me into the Metacrisis and Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Orr and that group of people, John Vervaeke. And I think in regards to the embodiment, I definitely had a lot of anxiety in my body at that time. And I think it's a necessary part of the process. I think if you're a sensitive person emotionally, I think if you're just a person with any heart or any um emotional capacity, confronting these systemic issues is very troubling. And it's very tempting to just deny, or not to deny, but to turn away and to distract yourself. And I was kind of alternating between distracting myself and being in a state of anxiety about the meta crisis more broadly. And that also applied to AI safety, which I got into it at the start of 2025, because I was quite into effective altruism. And I was on a retreat for a couple months, well, on and off, and reading about AI safety. And I think that was another major shock to the system, so to speak, kind of emotionally, viscerally accepting the AI capabilities progress and seeing the trend and feeling that in my bones, what that actually meant, not in an abstract way, but in a real way, in an embodied way.
What was that like to feel it in your bones in that way?
Well, I felt kind of insane because basically almost everyone I spoke to about AI in early 2025 was still not that informed about the trajectories, the trends in AI capabilities development. So, for example, there was this paper in early 2025 that looked at the context length of AI, well, LLMs, frontier AI models. So the context length is basically the complexity of a task that an AI can perform, and it's measured by how long it would take a human to do it. So, say something like writing a short essay on a topic might take a human 2 hours. So that would be the context length of that task. Um, and there was this paper that looked at the context length for LLMs and found that it had been doubling every 7 months since the end of 2019, I think. And that trend was kind of on track up until the paper was published in early 2025. And that's kind of an example of you can look at that in an abstract way and be like, oh, okay. I mean, they're getting better quickly, but so what? Or you can really look into that deeply and extrapolate that trend and think about the next 5 to 10 years of AI progress if that trend continues and what it might look like. And that is that is kind of really confronting that reality is enough to make you panic, I think, in a way. It feels like this unstoppable revolution that is coming full steam ahead. I think AI 2027 is an even better example of a piece of writing that really made me confront the possibility of superintelligence in the next 5 or so years. And yeah, that definitely made me very stressed. And I guess, in a subjective sense, yeah, it feels like, I wouldn't say it's like, oh, we're all gonna die, but it's like, oh, we all might die soon. And things are not going to be the same, but it feels like business as usual. There was this really big contrast between how people were acting and thinking and what people were talking about in the popular media and just in popular culture, and this trajectory that we're on, this exponential trajectory of machines becoming super intelligent and basically changing the whole world, changing the whole economy, maybe becoming autonomous and misaligned and killing everyone, or allowing bad actors to create super viruses that kill everyone, things like that, um, all within quite a short time span. Not within 50 years, but within 5 to 10 years. And yeah, it's still, I
Mm.
think I don't feel that crazy anymore, which is May 2026. I think people are waking up to AGI and not super intelligence so much, but I think there has been a massive shift this year, in particular, politically and in popular culture, about the implications of AI. But it's still it's still very anxiety provoking. I think anxiety is the best emotion to describe the feeling of thinking about AI and the future of humanity in regards to AI. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that depth of response. And yeah, I appreciate you including more of a personal share as well. It felt important. So it seems like part of what I'm hearing you say is that you're someone who has shown a capacity to actually feel some of these aspects of reality. And that in itself is kind of a revolutionary act, because there's actually very, very few people who can feel the significance of these developments. As you're saying, most people are looking the other way, or maybe understanding something of what's going on, but not really feeling it, not really sitting with it
Mm.
in a deep way. And it seems to me that that kind of response, really contemplating it, really understanding it, letting it drop into one's body, this kind of response is really necessary if one wants to ask any kind of question along the lines of what could be done. Is there anything that can be done? Because what I heard you saying is that you're still interested in exploring the space of possibility, the space of becoming, what human futures could come into being by our hand. And it's not that that's exactly sort of directly opposed to AI induced extinction, but it kind of has to be, So is there a way for more consciousness, right, to show up in a way that's relevant, in a way that might help? in a way that might have some influence on the trajectory. And what I'm hearing is that you're open to asking that.
Yeah, I definitely am. And well, there's the more short-term issue of directly addressing, say, AI risk, and then the more long-term issue of, well, what do we do when, assuming that AI goes relatively well, there's not going to be many jobs. What are we going to do with our time? And I think the optimal answer is a revolution in culture and a reorientation towards collective transformation and bringing back these communities and retribalization, I guess, is maybe how you would put it. Bless you. Um,
Why does that seem important to you? I
yeah.
mean, so like my sort of take on this is like whether by utopia, as in we get the AI sort of good future where everything we have a lot of abundance, right? And then we get to basically live however we want and get back to doing the art and culture and spirituality that we couldn't do when we had to do all the labor, which now AI can do or something like that. So through utopia, we get tribes again, or through dystopia, as in AI wipes out all but a small segment of humanity, if not all of us. And then this is the Mad Max future, right? Little groups of humans have to sort of get together and work out how to move things forward, like one way or another, through utopia or dystopia or some combination of both. There's this orientation toward tribes again. As in,
That's a good
that's a
point.
shift that I see. That's a shift that I see going on in the world, regardless of whether we want it to be happening or not. It does seem to be the direction. Um, and I think, like you sort of explicitly invoked collective transformation, and I'm wondering why. Like my sort of response to that is sort of, hey, if AI sort of immediately decides to destroy everything, there's not really a lot that we can do about that, unfortunately. But it does seem to be like this stopping the multipolar trap arms race dynamics, where like all of the major AI players get into these like short-term incentive traps, where they basically worry about themselves rather than worrying about everyone. And, this is or US and China in the same kind of multipolar trap problem. And so the question is like, is there a way to sort of, I don't know, I don't know, would the right phrase be give rise to or to facilitate the emergence of the kind of consciousness, by which I mean consciousness, love, and agency, that kind of a force. Can we even imagine the kind of a force of sufficient love, consciousness, and agency that could actually put a halt to those multipolar trap problems in some way?
Hmm.
And that's a big
Not in the
question,
short
like,
term, I think.
right.
Well, I think the in the short term, say 5 to 10 years, the most the best way to escape the multipolar trap is for everyone to realize the existential stakes. And basically, if everyone realizes, oh, hey, if we build super intelligence without solving the alignment problem, we're probably just all going to die. So we don't really want to die. Um, so why don't we work together to solve the alignment problem before we build super intelligence? I don't think a cultural revolution is going to happen quickly enough to affect the key decision makers in these arms races, say the top AI CEOs or Trump and Xi Jinping. Um,
So on this
yeah,
reading, what we'd be trying to do is like solve multipolar traps as a sort of class of problem, even though there are already like existing specific instances of the multipolar trap problem that maybe can't be solved with this technique, with this method. Um, as in
sorry, are you
like
saying
the way
what
to
kind of?
prevent like the way to solve the class of multipolar traps is essentially to prevent them from arising in the first place. that kind of thing, like to stop them at the very beginning, right? But by the time they get sort of played out to the point where there's a multipolar trap arms race dynamic between these like superpowered AI companies or superpowered global superpowers that, that we can't really do a whole lot about that to the point where we
We
can't
can
even
do, I think
imagine.
we can do a bit.
Mm,
I think direct political action is good. And to anyone listening, I think, for instance, Control AI has an excellent um, template for emailing your MP. Um, that means your politician about the extinction risk of AI. And I think there definitely is space for some means of trying to directly influence key decision makers. Um, Pause AI is another organization that I'm quite fond of, and they do a lot of direct lobbying as well, but also protests to raise awareness. And these are small things, but they can have a meaningful difference.
mm,
I mean, obviously, if you wanted to change your whole career trajectory to work in AI safety, like alignment or good policy making, then that's an awesome step to take. But for most people, that's not what they would be good at or what they would be interested in. So
mm,
I think emailing your MP is just a concrete action that you can take to maybe affect the multipolar trap dynamic in some way.
mhm,
But I think I think in this instance, I know you're talking about what are the cultural conditions to that are sufficient for us to avoid creating more multipolar traps. That is a I think everyone realizing the existential stakes of the technologies that we're creating is in itself a solution to the multipolar trap problem. And it was the case with nuclear weapons, I think.
mm,
I remember that there was this film called Threads that was a British film released in the 70s about what it would look like, what a genuine nuclear holocaust would look like, and how survivors would try to cope in that reality. And it was so popular. I think it might have broken some records for the most viewed television film of all time in Britain at the time. And I remember that Ronald Reagan watched it and he said it made him depressed for a few weeks. The reality, the illustrated, because there's the there's the abstract recognition of, oh, we don't want nuclear war because that would be really bad. But then actually seeing it with your own eyes, what it would look like, that's much more embodied, which is kind of what we're talking about. Um, you have that embodied acceptance and confrontation with this terrible reality that could unfold. And yeah, Reagan watched that and he said he was depressed for a few weeks. And then later he met up with Gorbachev to kind of de-escalate the Cold War, and each side agreed to slowly reduce their nuclear stockpiles bit by bit. And Reagan sent the director of Threads a letter saying that don't think that you didn't have a role in helping these negotiations take place. So I think that's a good example of people realizing um, the risk landscape of the game theory scenario that they're in. And if everyone can be on a similar page about the risk landscape of these technologies, AI in particular, that is a really good step to take. And I think people are waking up to the cybersecurity risk for sure with Mythos. Um, but yeah, that is the most effective short-term deterrent to this arms race dynamic, I would say, is
Hmm.
people being on the same page and having the same information about the risks of making of furthering this arms race and furthering this mad race to deployment and to increasing capabilities and not prioritizing alignment research. Yeah,
Hmm.
but a genuine cultural revolution based on love and awareness and altruism is a much longer term project, I think.
Well, I specifically mentioned agency. I'm sort of basically saying, yeah, the sooner that we bring about the tribes of the future, the sooner that we can clean up the mess. And what I mean by that is that individuals are relatively disempowered to do anything about the combination of metacrisis and meaning crisis. And the existing institutions are also relatively disempowered to do anything about it. And so, like, while I'm not, you know, emailing our MP is great, right? And so we can participate in existing institutions that way. But it seems to me, again, an inadequate kind of response. And so, like, what
Mm,
I'm committed to is the emergence of new forms of agency. I remember Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke were talking about this a bit in Vervaeke's essay about AI back in 2023. So this is not like completely out of nowhere. It's the idea that, I mean, they talk about it in the context of egregores, right? This collective spirits is that which binds a community together. For example, for the Athenians, it was Athena, a binding spirit. And so this is the kind of notion that communion is at the basis of community, is at the basis of culture. And that by, situating ourselves within a different cultural context, with a different kind of worldview and practices to go along with that, that it's possible to give rise to a combination, as I said, of agency, consciousness, and love, I think, in a phrase, although other qualities as well. But decision making and response capability, right? I'm remembering from Schmuchtenberger, the OODA loop concept. This is from military theory, like OODA loop. So orient, I don't know, help me with that one. Was it
observe, orient,
observe, orient,
side, act,
decide,
or
act?
something.
Okay, well, I'm saying that the capacity, like the capacity of these groups to do that is going to be better than existing institutions and existing individuals.
Yeah, but then it's a
Yeah.
question of scaling them up, I think, right? Because if you have these really integrated communities that have sense of communion, how do you get past Dunbar's number and make them a genuinely global phenomenon
Mm,
that is actually coordinated, intentionally coordinated in some way, but also disparate enough and heterogeneous enough so that people actually continue to engage in these communities.
mm, mm. Well, I wouldn't sort of expect to solve all that today. What I would simply say is that
Yeah.
there's sort of one protocol for community coherence, as in within a tribal context, within a community context, what holds that group together. And there's one like way of life, or probably many ways of life that support that and facilitate that. Importantly, this isn't just about like going back to something that we forgot a long time ago. It's about giving rise to, let's say, the emergence of new forms of culture and consciousness and cognition that we have not yet
Mm.
known. And I think what goes along with that is new intertribal dynamics. So, for example, we don't want the tribes to get stuck in their own version of the multipolar trap problem, which was actually the reason for, roughly speaking, the invention of civilization in the first place. Which is like if one of the tribes starts using bow and arrows to kill everyone, well, then the other tribes are all incentivized to get together in a larger than Dunbar-sized group in order to defend themselves. And so that's where empire comes from. It's like, hey, let's all get together, and then we don't all know each other anymore because we're a group much bigger than 150, roughly speaking. And so we have to work out how to do this larger scale governance that it's very difficult to make it work properly. I sort of won't go on about that, just to say that there's what I understand to be like we can start to work on protocol for how tribes themselves relate to each other. which is different from a kind of protocol that hold the tribe together, although it's based
Hmm.
on similar principles. This is like Tyson Yunkaporta talks about this in terms of relationality. So this is the relational ontology shift. Is that because look, here's the thing with that multipolar trap thing. I really want to talk about this because it's so important. Like there's a sense that the issue with the prisoner's dilemma or with any kind of multipolar trap problem is that we don't realize that we have common interests. We don't realize that. But it's not just about common interests, it's about a shared sense of identity. So it's that the way that the individual actor in the multipolar trap, social trap problem, the way that they perceive themselves is not true to the situation. Because the situation is such that we're all equally dependent on the commons, basically. And in fact,
Hmm.
it's possible to conceive of that commons as an extension of one's own body because we participate in it in the same way. Like we're dependent on that commons in the same way that we're dependent on our own body. If we take the
Yeah.
ocean as an example, like, well, what are we without the ocean? Well, we couldn't exist without the ocean being there.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so
So
what I'm talking about is it's a kind of awakening process. I've talked about this in terms of extended awareness or awakening as all of this, right? All of this common space that we are is realizing that that's actually part of us.
yeah, that
You know what I
really
mean? And
converges with the
yeah,
idea of expanding your moral circle. I'm not sure. Some maybe it was Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism, or Peter Singer or someone more EA adjacent, effective altruism adjacent. It really is kind of pointing to the same concept, I think. Your moral circle is the group of things that you care about and deem as morally worthy of respect and um, having fundamental rights, and that your interests are common, you have common interests with them. And yeah, it really is about expanding your sense of identity to the global context as much as possible. And that might be only humans at the start, say all of humanity. And I guess the UN and the fundamental Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Charter of Human Rights is a good example of an attempt to have a globally contextual um, understanding of shared interests. But it, I think you're right that it needs to be more than that. It has to extend to the earth that we inhabit, the material system that we're in, um, and having a respect for that as well, because that is really us. I mean, what are we without the water that we drink and the food that we eat and the ground that we walk on and the air that we breathe and the animals that we coexist with? Yeah, we're nothing really. So yeah, I do you think that the these ecology of practices will necessarily facilitate that extended awareness that you talk about?
that's a good question. I think the ecology of practices is designed to sort of support and inform and structure and sort of coalesce and shape something which is deeper. So I think there's some sense of it has to be just like the dynamics of spirit. We're talking about becoming like we're talking about the evolution of consciousness essentially in terms of spirituality. So we're talking about whether you talk about it as a rebirth of God or as collective awakening or sort of something emerging from the depth of our being. And I don't think we can sort of that's religious language is the language that we have to talk about that kind of thing. And I don't think that can be sort of skipped over. So when we're talking about extended awareness, like or collective awakening, awakening as all of this, it's fundamentally it's an ontological, metaphysical, existential shift in our sense of reality, in our sense of who we are, and what life is. And it's one of the qualities of that process is that um, it's cosmogonic in the sense that it can give birth to a new world. So what that means is that we essentially start to inhabit the world in a completely different way. We have a different existential stance. We relate to ourselves differently. We relate to the world differently. So we experience the world in a different way. And we haven't really noticed that that's even possible to a large extent because, again, we've been conditioned to sort of believe and to assume that this is the way that we are because it has been the way that we are, only it doesn't have to be. And unless we sort of discover that transformatively or experientially, it's hard to notice. And so the answer to your
Yeah,
question
I
seems to me like that ecology of practices scaffolds that awareness or coming into awareness. And I think like particularly we've talked, I mean, Viveki talked about not only an ecology of practices, but a worldview, right? That sort of guides and yeah, it's like a sacred canopy within which that ecology of practices functions. So the ecology of practices is something operating at the procedural level, but then there's something deeper in an existential sense. And there's something more sort of global in the sense of our entire worldview that are not exactly reducible to particular practices. And I think like because if we apply this, I mean, again, Tyson Yunkaporta talked about this in terms of relationality in his book Sand Talk and then Right Story, Wrong Story. It's about the quality of the space between us, which I'm kind of imposing on at the minute by just ranting like this. But the point is that there's a quality of the
no.
space between us that we're trying to feel into here, right? With our embodied spaciousness derived from Vipassana and whatever else we've been practicing, breath work, for example. But that relational ontology, that sense of waking up as the relationship, that the relationship comes first in some way, and that we actually arise out of that relationship rather than that relationship being an emergent property. So putting the relationship first means that the between space between us is put first. But it's not only between you and me, it's also the between space between us and whatever witness, whatever viewer is present, right? And then there's a relationship between those three, right? And the, the relationship between the event of this conversation and it's being listened to, like because the fact that it's listened to is a part of the event of this conversation, and how that influences our relationship with existence, with the world, which is or with matter, which is again, it's the quality of the fourth for anyone following along in the background. But what I'm saying is that this principle of relationality is fractal. It extends all the way up and all the way down. Not only between us, not only between us and a witness, not only between all infinity of those and the world or reality or life itself, but then also we talked about in a community context, like very practically, not only a protocol for I call community coherence or intertribal coherence. Intra-tribal coherence. But then again, between tribes. So what practices, what protocol, right? How can we live such that there's a principle of reciprocity? There's a principle of like sacralizing the between space between tribes that we haven't actually seen before. That would be a genuine cultural innovation if I'm right about that. And then again, not only
Yeah.
that, but also meta-tribal frameworks because it's different. It's different, like because again, this is the idea that we sort of uh, the internet is like a big deal, right? I mean, in ways that we haven't noticed yet. So because we can all work online, we can basically do all the creative mind getting together things online rather than in cities anymore. And that means that cities are no longer the place to be, which is basically part of this is from Jordan Hall's From City to Civium. It's part of the sort of gravitation toward tribes, right? Is that we don't have to be in cities anymore. But the point is that with the help of the internet, like the internet is a technology, or it's not, it's more than a technology, it's more like a world space, sort of unlocks the digital as a sphere in the same way that we unlocked
Yeah.
memetics as a sphere, right? It unlocks the possibility for certain meta-tribal frameworks, not inter-tribal frameworks. But this is kind of like global governance, but it's more like a spiritual hierarchy. So, for example, we were talking earlier about egregores, as in the spirits that bind community. For example, I invoked Athens. I talked about Athena. Athena is the spirit which binds Athens. Well, imagine that those egregores, that they each bind different communities, right? Well, each community is maybe devoted to something different because each community is contextualized, localized. Well, imagine that those egregores are themselves in relationship. Imagine that those egregores themselves form community.
Hmm.
Well, this is
Yeah.
surely this is genuinely new, right? We've never had even a conceptualization necessarily of a meta-tribal framework in that way before. mean, previously it would just be like the gods warring among themselves without necessarily a shred of consciousness to be seen. Another way of talking about this would
Yeah,
be Christ consciousness scaled all the way down and all the way up.
it's really hard to get
Yeah.
past that notion that in this meta tribe, or yeah, in this meta tribe egregores, this tribe of tribes, how do you avoid the possibility of competition? Because I mean, on a crude level, one way you mentioned Athena, in certain online communities, you could have a community based around a celebrity. So say, I don't know, Kim Kardashian or someone or Taylor Swift. And that that person is the guiding force that binds together all of the fans of this celebrity. And this celebrity is kind of at war with other celebrities in a way, in terms of popularity or maybe um, romantic scandals or things like that. Um, yeah, and it's hard to imagine because if we're going to have a hierarchy in terms of these egregores, say there's certain celebrities that are more popular or something like that, it's really hard to get rid of that sense of competition because all the celebrities are kind of competing for fame in a way. And maybe that's too reductive to talk about it like that because obviously there is space for genuine connection between celebrities and genuine love and a mutual appreciation. Maybe it's not the
Don't you
best
think the
example,
context,
but
don't you think, I get what you mean, but don't you think that, it's not a problem with competition per se, it's with competition that isn't bounded, right? So there's a way that, like, when two players are playing chess or when two teams are playing football or something like that, they both cooperate to give rise to the conditions for the game to occur. They both, again,
hmm,
they both cooperate to give rise to the conditions that are required for the game to occur. So in Viveki, this is the
yeah,
topic of enabling constraints, right? Selective constraints and enabling constraints. And I mean, without going on about that, because it's sort of too cogsci, the point is that there are certain kinds of spirits that work to bind a community long term, and there are certain kinds that don't. And that's basically one of the differences. Like a community that's built around appreciating Kim Kardashian is not going to be very long lived and it's not going to support sustainable human existence because we have a lot of needs that are not met
no,
by Kim Kardashian, frankly. No offense to her. But the yeah, so that's like one thing, like being able to discriminate between which spirits actually support human life and its flourishing and which spirits like very much do not. And th that kind of discrimination is like really, really important spiritual capacity. And then it's not that necessarily that we choose hierarchy, it's that in some way hierarchy is inevitable. And that no, because it's like it's all sort of got to fade back into one in a sense. Um, although I'm not sort of committing myself to either monotheism or polytheism. I think many different polytheistic systems had a sort of one God in the sort of background at the same time. So I don't really see that those are mutually exclusive. Yeah, I think there probably is a spiritual hierarchy, and I don't think we necessarily, I think we're kind of like cells in a body, right? You and I, like we're kind of like cells in a body. And by participating in, the kinds of community, the kinds of social organization that can actually be a part of the future, I think those then have a say in what kind of meta-tribal dynamics actually operate. I think speculating about it isn't necessarily very helpful. It's more to just sort of gesture toward that territory and say that it could be possible. I think
right, to have
sort
a
of, yeah, we've got a way
community
to go before there.
that is self-sustaining and an appropriate response to the meta crisis and the meaning crisis, and one that can also exist alongside like communities to form some kind of fractal structure that scales all the way up to the global structure. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. But yeah, if we're just talking about this one instance of this tribe, it clearly needs some communion practice, but then a protocol for relating to other tribes. Is that correct? Is that a good?
Yeah,
summation of
yeah, I think
what
like
you're what
basically
talking about?
there's a kind of existential shift that I'm sort of talking about and gesturing toward, but which is hard to sort of pin down. It's not really something that can be defined, I think. It's more like um if we talk about an ecology of practices, then like what I'm wanting to talk about is that those practices support an awareness of the space between us.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, just give me 1 second here. Yeah, as we resume here, I think basically there are very few, I think, genuine sources of hope. And I think the direction toward communion among the members of a community, which is basically cohering a multiplicity back toward unity again. Although not only unity, it's more about the dynamic relationship between integration and particularization or differentiation, which is a kind of complexifying breathing dynamic. It's about building these opponent processing relationships into community itself. And that, I think, is a direction toward coherence within groups. And I gestured toward both between groups and at a meta tribal level. And that, I think, is a genuine source of hope, or it can be. And definitely, it's a direction that I find very compelling to investigate practically. And the ecology of practices is basically designed to support that. But there's an existential shift, I think, that can be like the practices can serve as a vessel or a vehicle for that existential shift. But I think it's ontologically primary or prior in a way that practices cannot capture,
You mean it's greater than the practices themselves?
or not reducible to those practices.
Yeah,
But I also think that we have, following Viveki, many rational reasons to understand why those practices are so essential. And I do mean that they're essential, but they're sort of necessary but not sufficient.
yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, it's what could you talk more about the opponent processing and the particularization versus integration, was it?
Yeah, so this is stuff from Viveki and the sort of cognitive science of relevance realization, which he talks about in episodes 30, 31, and 32 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis back in the series released in 2018, and then in book form more recently. So this is about like yeah, so opponent processing relationships where they're about like the dynamic balance between polarized opposites. So for example, the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the nervous system are sort of pushing and pulling like this,
Mm.
right? Or I'm trying to think of other examples. These are basically all the way through our brain, like our left and right hemisphere do something roughly equivalent. And so, yeah, opponent processing relationships refer to the balance between sort of competing strategies, where, for example, he talks about, um, yeah, like in terms of the way that neural networks fire in the brain. This is like, again, very rough neuroscience. Um, there's a way that neural networks have a strategy which is toward particularization, toward like doing different things at the same time. And there's a different dynamic which is toward integration, like and like basically there's a trade-off there between efficiency and resiliency. Like the more
Mm.
that you particularize your way of being in the world, the more that you can do many different things, well, the more resilient you are because the more you can adapt to whatever situation happens to come along. But the cost for that is it's not a very efficient way to exist because you're very particularized, roughly speaking. Again, that doesn't really make sense, but the point is that John already talked about a lot of this stuff, and so people could go back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis if they're interested in delving more into what he takes opponent processing to mean. I'm sort of got a more sort of Jungian flavor on what opponent processing is, as in if we can divine a pair of opposites that is sort of like existentially chunky. So not just like any pair of opposites that we can think of, but like ones that really matter. We could think of some examples along the way, but the ones that we were working with at the start of this conversation, for example, between psyche and matter, or between mind and body, are pretty good examples. Like those are pretty fundamental conflicts that we all grapple with in our lives. Those are like real. I'm saying that those conflicts are substantial. And opponent processing basically refers to how to create a dynamic balance between each of those polarities at the same time. So it's like how to hold that conflict within a broader space, the image of which is Christ being crucified, right? What he did was that he held those opposites when he was crucified in that way. And so if we can understand this opponent processing in terms of like how the brain already functions, but also as a sort of normative direction for community practice, then we can understand that like by defining different pairs of these opposites that we find it hard to hold within ourselves, we can talk about that and then practice toward that holding within group contexts. So what I'm saying is that the sort of if we like I'm going to use a phrase called spiritual prowess, which I've never used before. The more spiritual prowess we have, the more of these different pairs of opposites we can hold without getting caught up in the conflict between them. And so this is a sort of gesturing toward a sort of
Yeah.
it's actually a meta-tribal normative guideline toward the functioning of groups because there's no claim here that a particular polarity is better to hold than any other. It's basically pick the fundamental dualities that you want to talk about, between one and many, or between Atman and Brahman, or between man and God, or whichever that, float your boat. And then can we talk about how your group functions in terms of holding many different pairs, many of these different polarities, where in a sense, what I'm saying is the better groups are going to be able to hold more of those and not get caught up in these polarizing tensions that are splitting the world apart and splitting apart
Yeah,
individual
I see
psyches.
what you mean. Yeah, so there's a comprehensiveness to the ideal group. It can hold all of those paradoxes and tensions in the space itself. But I guess when it fails to do that, there is some fracturing process in each individual and in the group itself and in the group's relationship to other groups. Or the group just collapses if it's not sustainable in some way. Um, yeah,
I think, hang on, there's something there about I don't think we have to be perfect. And this is
no,
maybe the difference from the sort of Christian claim or the Christian end of things is that there's a directive towards perfection which is there, which I'm not necessarily sharing. In the sense that I don't think any group or any individual is tasked with becoming capable of balancing all the different pairs of opposites within them. I mean, that's maybe a worthy aspirational goal, but a man's reach should always exceed his grasp, kind of thing. Where
mm,
like if we can't handle certain polarities because we're dealing with other ones, for example, I mean, this is very abstract, but then we can sort of outsource those to other people. And so this is about um, particularization or like role distribution, basically. As in different tribes. So at a tribal level, it's like, well, different tribes might specialize in different practices. So we don't all have to become exactly the same. And so something about drawing out our individuality, our uniqueness, the uniqueness of different groups is going to mean that they're not all infinitely capable of everything, but collectively they maybe have a capacity which is more than the sum of the parts. In the same way as within
yeah,
a tribe, right? The same way as within our body, like our liver cells don't do a very good job as neurons, but that's not their job.
yeah, that's
They
true.
outsource the job of the neurons to the neurons, if that if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Or in an effective business, you have people who are really good at, bookkeeping or the actual research and development or sales or, you know, um, general organization, things like that. You have that specialization. Yeah. But then a business itself on a meta level is oriented towards one variable, which is money, and that variable collapses the whole range of human values and worldviews into one number, which is inherently problematic because it's just not a sustainable value to orient towards. But if you're kind of hearkening to this value of, or this worldview of relationality as the fundamental good, I guess, which these tribes need to orient towards. And I think, yeah, there's something really to that. I guess I haven't really thought about it that deeply, this relationality idea, but I think, yeah, there's the more you can deeply relate and be bound to and connect to other beings and the systems in which you live, there's kind of something inherently sustainable in that way of thinking because an understanding of the context and the world in which you live and an appreciation of all its variety and all its richness is something that allows you to really have this positive feedback loop of
Mm.
increasing cooperation and participation, good participation in the world and with other tribes and other individuals. And if all the people in the system are orienting towards optimal relationality, then
Mm.
it opens up so much space for better action. Because Krishnamurti, he said that, oh, I think someone is
Yeah, hang on one
talking
second.
to you.
So as we've decided to come to an end here, is there anything that you want to say to finish off our dialogue for the moment?
Yeah, I I'm reminded of this Krishnamurti quote that the understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. And I think that really addresses the heart of what we're discussing, that optimizing for relationality and a deep understanding of the relation both within ourselves, the sum of our parts, but also ourselves to the material world, ourselves to other individuals, ourselves to the tribe, um, tribes between tribes, things like that. That really is a good fundamental value to orient towards, and one that I think I understand why you're saying that that is an existential shift that is necessary to have an appropriate response to the meta crisis and the meaning crisis. Um, and yeah, I enjoyed our conversation. I think I'm looking forward to discussing more of this,
Mm.
maybe understanding a bit more where you're coming from.
Mhm.
And yeah, happy to be here.
Well, amen. Very happy to be in dialogue with you. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful way to slowly start to flesh out more of the fundamental concepts. And not only concepts, but commitments that underlie this orientation toward like something a little bit deeper than, hey, we need an ecology of practices. It's like, no, it's a little bit of a deeper shift than that. And starting to unpack why and how exactly. So yeah, thank you for your shared exploration. It's a pleasure of mine, and I can't wait to do this again, maybe the same evening. Let's see.
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
see.